Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's create a scrappy Christmas tree wall hanging. So let's get started. Here's a list of supplies you'll need for this project. So to get started, I started by piecing several pieces of my scrap fabric for my backing fabric, and I just pieced those together. And then I also took a piece of scrap batting that I had, and I'm going to create a quilt sandwich. Now my background fabric is a piece of muslin, and I cut it and I pressed it, and it measures approximately 22 inches by 15 inches. Now you can make this any size that you like. Your Christmas tree will be either larger or smaller than the one that I'm creating. So next I'm going to pin this quilt sandwich together, and I'm just using some straight pins in order to pin these layers together to take it to the sewing machine and to do some quilting. Now you can use free motion quilting to quilt these 3 layers together, or this would be a great time to use some of your decorative stitches. But you just want to make sure that you quilt all 3 layers together. And I'm putting quite a few pins in here because I didn't want any of my layers to shift, and I didn't want any wrinkles or creases. So now that I'm all pinned together, I'm going to trim around the edges just so I can decrease some of the bulk when I take it to the sewing machine. And I'll just roll it from the bottom just to transport it to the sewing machine and to get it underneath the sewing machine needle. So I've chosen a decorative stitch that I stitched all the way around the quilt sandwich, and then I also trimmed up the quilt sandwich too on all 4 corners. So my next step is to cut my strips, and these are just some scrap fabrics that I had, and I cut them in half inch, 1 inch, 1.5 inches to 2 inches. And I also have a square brown fabric for the tree trunk that measures 3.5 inches square, and then I have another piece that'll be my star, and it's a 6.5 inch square. That's the yellow piece. Now in using some craft paper, I cut a triangle so that it could go from end to end of my background fabric. And then I'm going to start by pinning my tree trunk into place, and I'm going to put it where it's about 1/2 inch from where the triangle shape is, and it's about 1.5 inches from the bottom, and I'm just going to pin that in place. Now I want to make sure that my fabrics are going to extend past my triangle shape of my tree shape. So I just kind of lay them out just to make sure that they extend. If they didn't, I would just piece them together. So now I'm just going to mark around this on my background fabric. I'm using a pen, and I'm not worried about if it's going to show because I'll cover that up with some stitching later. You can use any marking tool that you like. And then I just remove this pattern. So now I can see my markings of where the outline of my tree is. But before I start to lay those out, I'm going to use my Wonder Under fusible web. You can use any kind of fusible web you like. And on the paper side, I'm going to trace out a star. And I just traced this star from a coloring book that I had. And it's on the paper side. And then I just had some hand-dyed fabric, and I want my star to be yellow. It could be any color you'd like. Following the manufacturer's instructions, I'm going to press that onto the backing of my fabric. And then after my fusible has been pressed down and it's cooled down, I'm going to cut out the shape of my star. And I'm going to cut right on the line because this won't be a turn under applique. When I applique this on, I'm going to do a zigzag stitch around the edge of the star. And this star can be any size that you like. This is just the size that I had in my coloring book that I traced. So now I put my star down. I haven't taken off my paper backing just yet. I'm just putting it in place so I'll know where my strips are going to go. So now I'm going to start by laying my first strip out. Now I don't want these strips to go horizontally or vertically. I want them to go at various angles. So I will turn them crisscross one another and overlap each other. And this is just a random overlapping. Some will be close together, some will be further apart. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And I'm just kind of grabbing my strips just randomly. And I want some of the background fabric to show through the strips, so I'm not trying to cover all of the background fabric up. And I will just continue to do this, and I can see the outline of my tree. So as I go up, my tree starts to taper off. So my strips don't need to be quite as long. So some of the strips that I have that are a bit shorter, I will put toward the top of the tree. Now we will trim these strips in the shape of the tree after we get them all laid out. So just keep laying them out right now. Just making sure right now that you do have some overhang from the shape of your tree on both sides. And I am putting these fairly, I guess, close together, but still having some of the background to show because I wanted to have quite a few different colors of strips. I want it to look as scrappy as possible. So I will just continue to grab some strips, and if some that I think are a little bit too thick, I may trim those down. Now that all of my strips are all laid out, I'm going to put my pattern of my tree shape back down, and I pin it in place. And now I'm going to cut my strips to the shape of my tree shape. Now the one thing that I didn't do when I did this that I wish I had is I didn't have any fusible on the backs of any of these strips, and I didn't pin them down or even glue them down. So as I started to cut out the shape, they started to shift. You see that I'm trying to make sure that they're still in the shape of the tree, that I'm not cutting them too short. So next time I do this project, or when you do this project, make sure that you either put fusible on your strips. You can also use some school glue to hold these down, or just pin them in place before you put your pattern piece back on and start to cut them. So I'm just adjusting them now just to make sure that they haven't shifted from the shape of the tree and from the outline of the tree. So I'll just continue to trim off those edges, following again the pattern of the tree. And now I'm just trimming the other side. Making sure not to cut your quilt sandwich now. You're just cutting your strips. So now my strips are all cut in the shape of my tree. I'm going to take off that paper pattern. Now you can see that the strips are in the shape of the tree. I'm going to do any adjusting that needs to be done. And now I'll pin these all in place so that I can take it to the sewing machine and sew these down. But I really like the look of it so far. I think it looks really great. Now when I take it to the sewing machine, I'm going to do a zigzag stitch. You can feel free to use any decorative stitch that you like, or even use free motion stitching around this. So now I have them all pinned down, and I will sew a very narrow thick zigzag stitch around each of these strips. And then after I sewed the zigzag stitch around each of my strips, you can see I also sewed a zigzag strip around the edge of where my marking was for my tree, just to give it more detail of the shape of the tree, almost like an outline. And then I'm just making sure now that I'm trimming off any excess threads. And now I will place down my star at the top of my tree. I'll remove the paper backing, and then I'll just press this in place. And also, when I did my zigzag stitching on each of my strips, I did it in the color green because I wanted it to look like it was mimicking the tree. And now when I do the zigzag around my star, since it's yellow, I'll do yellow. When I zigzagged around my tree trunk, it's brown, so I also did that in brown. So now that the tree, the scrappy tree trunk, the scrappy tree is all done. The star is on, our tree trunk has been attached. It's time to put our binding on, and you can see all of the details of the stitching from the back. Now I have these Santa Claus strips that I used from a previous project that I also used in the Christmas tree, and they are cut at 3 inches wide. This is what we're going to use for the binding of the quilt. And so some of these are cut a little shorter, so I'm not going to sew them on the diagonal. We'll just sew these straight across. So I'll put right sides facing, and I'll just sew straight across with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I have to be very careful because I want all of my Santas to be going in the right direction. So if you have a directional fabric, make sure that you follow the direction of your fabric. And I'm going to continue to sew these together until I get enough binding to go all the way around the wall hanging. So now that I've sewn these bits together and I've created a long enough binding, I'm going to press these seams open just to help reduce the bulk. And we've created a long enough strip to go all the way around. I'm going to fold this wrong sides facing, and I'm going to press it. Now again, this is a 3-inch strip, so this is going to be a large binding, but that's okay. It'll give us some detail on the back of the quilt with the decorative strip that we have. So now that my strip is folded and it has also been pressed, I'm going to pin it in place on the right side of the quilt so that we can fold it toward the back. So I'm going to pin it. I'm going to start on the side, and I'm going to leave about a 6 to 7 inch tail that I'm not going to pin down. So about 6 or 7 inches that we won't pin down, and I'll start pinning. Now when I get to the top corner, I want to make sure that I stop sewing a 1/4 inch from that top corner so that we can make a miter on that corner when it's time to miter our binding strip. I put a pin there just to remind myself. I'll back stitch it there, and I will stop sewing 1/4 inch from the edge, and I'll back stitch there. And then we will miter the corner, folding it out and then back on itself. And I'll show you how to do that as we continue on putting on our binding strip. And I'm just marking at that other corner 1/4 inch from the edge, and we'll stop sewing there once we get to that part. So for right now, we'll just sew our first strip on, leaving our 6 inch tail that we won't sew just yet. So now to begin to miter the corner, I want you to fold your strip. You'll make your first fold away from your quilt, and you'll create an angle on that fold to the edge of your quilt, and then you will fold that binding strip back onto itself. And you'll create a fold that will be on that edge, and then the raw edge of the binding will meet the raw edge of the quilt top. And pin that in place. And remember, we did our pin to remind ourselves to stop sewing 1/4 inch from the edge. I'll back stitch at the beginning of the binding strip, and I will back stitch at that 1/4 inch mark. And you're sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, now to miter that corner, you're going to fold that strip up away from the quilt. You're creating that angle that goes from the bottom of the binding strip up to the top of the quilt top. You have an angle, and then you fold it back onto itself. And pin it in place. You'll have a fold there, and then the raw edges meet on that side. And I'm pinning the raw edge of the quilt binding to the raw edge of the quilt top. And I put a pin there to remind myself to stop sewing a 1/4 inch from the edge. And then I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitch at the end, at the beginning, and back stitch at that 1/4 inch mark. And once again, that miter corner, folding it up away from the quilt, creating an angle, folding it back onto itself. You have a fold at that end, raw end on that side, pinning everything in place. Remembering to stop stitching at that 1/4 inch mark. You can eyeball that 1/4 inch or you can measure it. Back stitching at the beginning and back stitch at that 1/4 inch mark. Now we're almost done. I want you to once again do your miter corner. Folding it back onto itself, pinning everything in place. Now this time I'm only going to stitch about 2 to 3 inches from the end because I want to leave myself a tail of unsewn binding so that I can miter these 2 pieces together, the end pieces together. You'll see there where I didn't sew that end piece completely, and I have that tail there at the beginning. I want you to fold your end tail. I want you to fold it so that it meets the beginning of that binding, and I want you to do a finger press. You can also mark this with a marking tool. I'm just going to do a finger press. Then I want you to open out your binding strip, open it completely flat. You can see where your crease is. If you can't see it, mark it. And I want you to face it toward you. Fold it toward yourself, and I'm just bringing in that end so that I can have a piece to work with. I want you to unfold the beginning part of the binding strip, and you're going to put it underneath. Put that raw edge underneath where your crease fold is, where you creased it. Put it underneath there. Put a couple pins there to hold it down. And now you're going to mark it at the diagonal, and I'm just going to mark these with my pins. So starting at the top, and you're going to diagonal all the way down to the bottom. And you can also mark this with a marking tool if you like. I'm just going to mark it with the pins. Take out your other pins because you want to be able to, when you fold it, see that it makes sure that it meets. And now that we know that it's going to fit our quilt, we'll take it to the sewing machine and we're going to sew right on those marks where we put the pins on the diagonal. Now that we have our diagonal seam, now you can trim away the rest of the binding. I'm just double checking, making sure that it lies flat. And then I'm going to trim away that excess binding strip that I have there. Trimming on that diagonal seam, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, once you press it out, it should fit the rest of your quilt. Press it and then put some pins in there, and then you'll take it back to the sewing machine and you will continue to stitch on your binding strip, and it should be completely sewn on. Now our binding strip is sewn all the way around. We're going to turn our binding strip to the back of our quilt. But before we do that, I want you to clip those corners, making sure not to clip through the seam. Just clip those edges so when you turn that binding, that mitered corner out, it will turn really nicely without that extra bulk. So you can press this binding strip away from the quilt, turn it toward the back, and you're going to turn it over. Now you'll be able to feel with your fingers where the edge of the quilt is. You'll be able to feel it, and that's how far you're going to turn that binding strip. And then pin it in place. And you'll do this all the way around. So I put a couple pins on one side before we miter the corner, and then I put a couple pins on the other side of that corner. And that'll make it easier now for you to miter that corner. So you'll fold in one side and fold in the other side. And now if your miter corner doesn't go in exactly right, you can just do a little bit of adjusting of your fabric there, and your miter corner should miter perfectly. And put a pin there. Continue to pin it down. You can feel that edge of the quilt. That's how far you're going to pull that binding strip to the back. Before I miter that corner, again, I'm going to pull that binding strip toward the back. Put a couple of pins on both sides of the corner. Then I will miter, so push one in toward the corner, pull the other end over. Any adjusting that you need to do, put a pin in that mitered corner. Making sure to stop at that 1/4 inch mark really makes it easy to miter that corner when it comes to turning it. Just putting some pins again in the rest of the binding strip. Pop a few pins on both sides of your binding strip, and then move on to folding in that mitered corner. Fold in one side, fold in the other. Adjust the fabric as needed, and pop a pin in. So far, our mitered corners are coming along really nicely. Just adjusting the strip, making sure everything is lying down flat. Now when you sew down the back of your binding strip, you can do this by hand, or you can do a decorative stitch. I'm going to do a zigzag stitch around the back of my binding strip. You can turn it toward the front and do a stitch in the ditch. But on such a small wall hanging, I'm just going to do a zigzag stitch. And that'll match the rest of the zigzag on my Christmas tree. So I'm going to stitch from the back. And then my wall hanging Christmas tree will be all done. So my scrappy Christmas tree wall hanging is all done. I really like the look of this. You see all of the decorative stitches from the back. Has a really nice texture on the back. But the star of the show is the scrappy tree on the front. So now I'm going to do some command strips to hang this on the wall. I didn't do a sleeve because it's so small and it's so lightweight. I'm just going to put the command strips right on the back of the quilt. So I'm going to take off the red paper backing and I'm going to press this onto the back of the fabric, and I'm really going to rub that to make sure that it sticks to the fabric. And this won't harm your fabric at all when it's time to remove the command strip. I'll leave this on to let it set for several hours before I actually attach it to the wall, and then I will remove the other paper backing and then just press it to the wall. And then after the holidays, I can remove it fairly easily without damaging the quilt or the wall. So I hope you like this project, and I hope you give it a try. And this is what it looks like hanging on one of my walls. And I think it turned out really good. So happy holidays from Z Marie Design. See you next year.